Thank you, Andrea. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Pardon me while I rearrange the technology and cross my fingers that these devices will also talk to Macintoshes. It's been, for me, a year of anniversaries. I celebrated my 35th wedding anniversary. I say I because I'm not sure that my wife was celebrating. Thank you. Last month I celebrated the 40th anniversary of my beard. It was once brown with red streaks. It isn't anymore. The important celebration this year is the 25 years of the Bled conference. And what I'm going to do is invite you to cast your mind back 25 years and then work forward with me to the present and into the future. And I have a 45-minute slide presentation which I'm going to need to do in 20 minutes, so please read quickly. So, 25 years ago, stop, think, who was in charge? Well, Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan at least thought they were in charge. Gorbachev, not just yet. An important fact was that Matej, I can't pronounce it properly, Gaspar was born in Zagreb Hospital. Anybody know the person? He's 24, 25 now. What was important about him? That the UN proclaimed him. Obviously, they could choose randomly, but that's the person they chose. Why is that significant to this conference and to 25 years? Do you know what the population of the world is now? Sustainability's been mentioned a couple of times. We have had a net increase of 2 billion people at the same time as increasing the well-being and the resource usage and the pollution to match those numbers. That's how much the world has changed in that time frame. Since it's the football season for the European Championships, we were thankful in a number of respects that we no longer have a Yugoslavia because it could be ruling the roost in world football. Instead, we have lots of different parts of the old Yugoslavia who create difficulties, and who knows what Croatia will do this evening. Anybody remember Bon Jovi? U2's first hit, anybody can name it? Well done, I can't. The Eurovision Song Contest has doubled in size. Eurovision is an interestingly flexible concept, as Azerbaijan showed us this year. The other Europe. There was no EU in 1987-88. This is when Yosha thought up the first conference and then ran the first conference. This is the situation we were in. The EU has come since and expanded and gone through many phases. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were, quote, in power, unquote. Gorbachev wasn't yet. So by the time the Berlin Wall fell, there had already been 2 conferences run by Yosha. This is quite a long time ago. And the most exciting conference, which was the first one I ever came to here in 1991, was held a few days, very conveniently for us, before the war occurred because we got out through the border first. Exciting times, and I hope we continue to have exciting conferences in a different way from the way we had it in 1991. So all of this had gone on in the first few years of the conference, and many of us have to dredge back into our memories to pull that together. Now, what were these conferences about then? They were about batched data transfer. They were about the brave new world of actually transferring data between organisations in an organised manner. Electronic interaction in almost the most primitive form that you could imagine it. Now, that's not a criticism of Yosha's choice of the original themes. It's a comment on where the world was, and therefore a comment on what the world has done during the last 25 years, and the reason why there is so much dynamic at this conference. That's the kind of ICT that we were using in 1987-88. Remember those? We now have tablets. They're not real computers, but within a little while they'll be forced to be real computers. That was a luggable. That's all we then had. Graphical user interfaces had been around for a short time, thanks to Xerox first and then Apple. Microsoft had been struggling for years, and they struggled for many more years before they made it really work. Sure, we had mobile phones. Well, some people had mobile phones, far, far fewer than have them now. They were only analogue, and 2G, so-called, was still to come, several years after Yosha started the conference. Why EDI? Because that's all we could do at that time. That was the stunner for me when I went back. I was thinking 9600 baud. At the time, 2400 BPS was your lot. And bulletin board systems were still how human beings talked to one another. Sure, there was the early phase Ethernet. Corporations had local area networks. In 1988, I did a survey of Australian corporations and government agencies for their email and EDI usage, and there was substantial email usage internally only in large organisations in Australia and, of course, elsewhere at the time. Internally only. We think of email as internet email. Sorry, that's not how it originally was. That's not how it was when Yosha started the conference. Sure, we had AppleTalk. In '86, I installed AppleTalk in the Australian National University, as many others doubtless did too. You couldn't really afford to install the other kinds of LANs at the time. In 1987, I ran a master's seminar at the University of Bern where we actually connected IBM PCs to a System 38. It was brand new at the time for a PC to be able to talk to anything else. That's the world we were in. Interorganisational systems is our bread and butter. We assume it. Well, in 87, 88, they're the main instances of interorganisational systems that existed. They almost entirely used, they did entirely use what we would now call physical private networks. We don't even bother using the term anymore. We assume that private networks are going to be virtual. They were only physical at the time. Three of those were they were master-slave networks, star networks with dumb terminals with limited electronics on the end of them. Only Swift was a peer-to-peer network of those networks. Sure, an internet just existed. 1983, TCP/IP. The ARPANET was still very early and very constrained in those days. ERP hadn't been invented yet. That's the world. Now, I'd like to talk quickly about information systems, but that's going to be one of the slides I have to skip in order to get to 20 minutes. That's the world of intra-organisational systems. That's what we knew about. We knew about underlying transaction systems that produce data. We had worked out ways by then of converting that data into something useful for decision makers. And we had started to play around with other kinds of data, invented data, what-if scenarios were beginning to really make some progress. That's where we stood in those days. Strategic information systems theory, which has been meat and drink to this conference for so long, only emerged. Porter's original book, which was the starting point for so much, was 1980. And that was early days and wasn't in information systems per se. And the proposition then was that smart decisions gain sustainable competitive advantage. And there were examples like these. That's all we had going. We've learned a lot since, as one of my later slides shows. So those early years of the Bled conferences focused on first EDI and then progressively into organisational systems. In 1993, the paper that I presented here used the electronic commerce word. It wasn't the only one, but it was one that argued we must now change. EDI has been making progress. We now have more possibilities, was the argument. Changes have occurred. Change has always occurred at this conference. We started out with dumb inter-organisational systems one-to-one. That, of course, went to M2N. We went mad trying to control all these protocols. Of course, we reverted to hub-and-spoke schemes. Initially, star networks with dumb terminals. Today, we think in terms of client-server and increasingly peer-to-peer. So we got this far in those early years during the course of those first approximately 8 Bled conferences. And at that point, with LANs finally mainstreamed in organisations, with the internet finally at our disposal, we moved on. And we had about a decade in which electronic commerce dominated. For some years, I argued we should have changed the word to electronic business earlier than we did in order to be broader than the notion of trading. But we really used the word electronic commerce to cover a great many things during that decade. And then, once again, ringing the changes, the conference overall theme was adapted to make it an e-conference, everything to do with electronic interaction. And that adaptation, adaptability, movement with the times, reflecting on drivers of change and opportunities that were presented by those drivers of change has been a hallmark in this place throughout its time. We saw new kinds of systems. They got different kinds of names. I preferred to use the term cascading systems for these kinds of things because there's a number of different subcategories. They could not be around in those early years. They had to mature. We had to have underlying capabilities and then the insights to be able to make these things work between organisations. Another one, and this is my term if you've never come across it, but it's been in the literature for a long time, we have had to reflect on the way in which inter-organisational and extra-organisational systems have different characteristics. The way that I always used to depict this was that if the people at the other end don't have a data processing manager, ooh, what an old-fashioned idea, a DP manager. In fact, an IT manager is old. If the people at the other end aren't quite sure whether they've got any technical support, and if they have, where to find it, that is a very different category of system from dealing with a partner that has got an IT department or a well-established outsourcing arrangement for IT support. You've really got to think the things differently. It's not just about user interfaces. So that idea, which originally ATMs and FPOS were the examples when I first wrote that in 1992, now with mobile devices, of course, we are into a whole new field and a dramatically and rapidly changing field. And something else that's happened in the last 5 to 7 years with the Web 2.0 sorts of notions, I use the word syndication, some people use that, some people use other words. In behind that organisational information system that each of us thinks we're dealing with on these machines and these machines, in behind that there's a whole pile of other organisations getting in on the act. Some of them legitimately transferring information across to banks, transferring information across to delivery organisations, and some of them pure marketing, the double clicks of this world, out in the background getting a slice of the action on our devices. A lot more complexity has developed. All of it reflected on at Bled conferences. Strategic IS theory has changed dramatically since those early times. We've discovered it's far more complex and far more worrisome, and I do think that Braw's covered quite a lot of the territory. He had one beautiful point that I'd love to have on that slide if I ever present this one again. But things that we've learned are that it's actually unusual to make a strategically breakthrough decision as a single organisation. It happens, but it's actually unusual. Far more common is that organisations take advantage of a change once it has already occurred. Exploit opportunity is much more common. First movers usually lose. It's an unfortunate fact of life, and it's one of the difficulties in achieving innovation because more and more people realise that they're taking big risks and that more often than not they'll be swamped by somebody who comes along second doing it just a little bit smarter or marketing better. In a lot of contexts, strategic and competitive are not the same thing. Many such circumstances, public sector obviously, but there's a very large third, fourth and fifth sectors of the economy where competition isn't the primary driving force. And indeed, within industry, collaboration has emerged stronger and stronger over the last 15 or so years. Strategic partnerships, common infrastructure and the like. So there's a huge amount that we've learnt, and again, we have reflected that in so many panels, workshops and papers in this conference. So we had a middle period of the Bled e-conference in which we had misspelt service providers who were doing lots of creative things. Lots of those were successful. And then, of course, some overreach occurred, investors did silly things, and we had a bust around 2000, but not for this conference. There was still just so much that needed studying, so much that was there as an opportunity for us as researchers to get out and understand. So we didn't slow down, even if some ISPs did. And they're the sorts of themes we did during that period. So much of it associated with organisations and what they could do, but just easing towards a bit more than just organisations. You see things like e-household and e-democracy starting to creep in during that phase. And then during what I'd call the mature period, the recent and current period, there's been focus on things other than just organisational applications and internationalisation. So information society and everything were harbingers of change, but we are talking about all aspects of electronic interaction, and I don't think I need to spend any more time on that because I do believe Braw covered a lot of those points very nicely, thank you. This is the phase that we've got to get into, an understanding of interaction between individuals, groups and organisations to the benefit of all of them in win-win environments. We said that how many years ago, Broad, did you say on that slide? Win-win has been around since 2000 or 1988 or something. We have got to get there, and organisations are increasingly appreciating that. So we saw a rather different set of themes emerge during this last decade. A few words about the conference and its organisation are really important here. There has always been a vital industry stream component to this conference of various kinds. There's been business meetings held here always over the years. It's lovely to see Georg Gottschlich back again. His was an excellent example of it. Customs was the particular field. This wasn't the only series of meetings that occurred, but it was one of the important ones. Bled was a locus for that community to work in, and both sides leveraged off one another, your community with all of the other ones and vice versa. Critical, I believe, in the early years and subsequently was supporters who had strong reputations. Why did I first come to Bled? Why did many of us first come to Bled? Because Yosha clapped us on the shoulder at a conference and said, "Roger, I've got this wonderful conference in a wonderful location, you must come." Originally, this was 1991, I said, "Yosha, why would I go behind the Iron Curtain to go to a conference?" "Well, Roger, it's because you know Doug Fogel, don't you? And you know Milt Jenkins." I said, "Well, I've met Doug, and I use Milt Jenkins' papers when I teach master's students, but no, I've never met Milt." "Well, you will when you come to Bled," he said. Those sorts of things were very important to us, and it continues to be the case that the long-standing friends in the organisation with reputations continue to spread the word. And of course the research stream has grown up and developed its own reputation and rolls on from year to year. But I must underline the importance of the conference leadership, because the faculty has been behind this throughout. Indeed, the university, the rector is here this morning, here this morning. That has been crucial. The commitment of successive members of staff, both academic staff, general staff and students of that faculty has been crucial to this conference and continues to be so. Thank you, everybody. The conference chairmanship from Yosha originally, and Andrea is already now 4 years in the conference chair. She's a really young woman, really. But the consistency and continuity that is brought is then complemented by the way in which successive research stream chairs bring freshness, bring diversity, sense changes, listen to and sample amongst the community here in order to work out what directions we should be moving in next. And pens were scribbling, well, maybe on screens. Keyboards were tapping as Braw was coming up with several of the extra threads that he believes we need to have in this conference in the next few years. The contributions from this conference are enormous. There's more than 1,000 papers that have come out. There's been 773 of them refereed until this year. We've added 51 this year, so we're well over 800 refereed papers now. 50 countries on the research program. On average, on each research stream program, 17 countries. And astonishingly, I've just done a quick count this morning, and I think it's 17 countries, right on average, on the research program alone, leaving aside the panels and industry stream activities. And many of them are not the mainstream ESIS academic conference kinds of clusters of authors. There's often a consultant scattered through. There's a lot of international teams involved. And that's one of the great strengths here. This year we've done a special section looking over the 24 conferences held to date. There will be a stream, one stream of the conference dedicated to that. There are 9 papers involved in it, and it's complemented by a session by the IFIP WC 8.4 working group. This will look at trends and challenges. In all cases, we're looking backwards in order to look forwards. We're not interested in the past for its own sake. We want to learn from it. Very briefly, yes, it must be very briefly, there's been a range of themes that are plucked out in a paper that I've put in this set of proceedings. They have not largely been about technology as the primary focus. Technology has been a driver, it becomes an enabler, and increasingly, as Broer says, we must look to it and select from the technologies in order to satisfy needs, not just be technology driven. We've always had something of that flavour here, but technology's always been in the background. We've had lots on categories of e-business, 60% and a whole 14% of the key terms in titles across the 773 papers. E-commerce variants are the single most outstanding volume. We've had a range of corporate perspectives that have matched those kinds of e-business, a lot of it tending towards the strategic. And then we have had areas in which particular research topics, coming from an academic perspective, have dominated the wordings. But I'm pleased to say not dominated the count. We have academic interests here, but within an applied, real-world instrumentalist context, we're trying to achieve something at this conference. There's a special section which you will no doubt be enjoying on your machines. Has this conference had impact? Well, as I said, there's 1,000 papers. Let me use an old slide from some years ago. That set of CDs, including the two that you've got this time, has doubled or slightly over doubled what's in that old photograph. In addition, and critically, 550 of those papers are up online, open access on the conference website and get used. They're also in the AIS, Association for Information Systems, e-library. There's been quite a few papers that have made it forward into special sections that we have arranged in a couple of leading journals, the two leading journals in this sphere. Google citation counts tell us something. Downloads from that library alone tell us a great deal. I'll skip, those stories will come in the session later. Let me talk very briefly about some challenges to complement what Broer was saying. Where should we be going from here? What can we learn from that history in order to move forward? Well, we haven't run out. It isn't the end of history. It isn't the end of opportunities for the Bled conference. Technologies alone will create a whole pile of additional challenges for us, such as those. I won't enumerate them. Critically, however, it's e-technology as it is used by organisations and people, which is what we need to understand, what we need to contribute to. And it's much more these kinds of things that I believe are going to need to be our focus. And I think I'd like to see personally a lot more on the politics of e-technologies and their use, because there are some very severe challenges that face us. We have underplayed the social importance over the years. It's not been missing, but it's been underplayed at this conference, I believe. We've also seen a serious risk of corporate and government interests getting control of the agenda, of governments and particularly the ITU, International Telecommunications Union these days, I think they renamed themselves, would like a much more controlled and structured internet. And there's a variety of parties who would like that. For censorship reasons, censorship writ in the most broad terms imaginable, including, unfortunately, IP censorship. We need to, I believe, have much more discussion about the politics aspects here than we've had in the past. That means that we've got to have even more diverse scope, economic and human perspectives, and the units of study in the papers that we do have got to be rich and varied in order to tackle the problems at the appropriate level. Because if you don't have the right level of granularity, you cannot understand phenomena. I'll skip that one because I skipped it before. I'll skip that and challenge researchers with those two slides some other time. I'll skip that because I can talk about it in 5 minutes' time. What I would have liked to have done today was to have one more picture slide right at the end. Imagine, if you will, a yellow balloon rising over the lake of Bled. One did this morning, and I photographed it. Two, yeah, the other one was blue, Doug. I photographed it, and I wanted to have it here. Unfortunately, my wife is walking up in the Treatlove Lakes, and she took the camera before I managed to download the photograph. Imagine, if you will, a yellow balloon rising over the lake. This is an important image for our challenges, because flying a kite is good, experimental, but a kite is still held down. It is still tethered. A balloon isn't. A balloon floats free. It takes much bigger risks than a kite does. And we've got to do a lot of that at this conference. We must continue to look for value. We must continue to look for the leading edge, the bleeding edge. We have to take risks. And that was more than 20 minutes. I'm sorry.